I did not expect either of my videos to Hank Green and SciShow about their unfortunate piece on knitting and physics to go quite so viral. The first one I made might be the most viral video I've ever had on TikTok. It's up there. It's up there for me. Y'all, I'm not going to waste an opportunity to talk about knitting. I could go on a million different tangents, and today I want to talk about knitting as resistance. Now, I made a video where I touched on this subject a number of months ago when people on the internet were giving AOC shit for knitting a sweater on public transit. Like, you should be fighting fascism instead of knitting a sweater while you're on your commute on the public transit system. That really got my hackles up, considering I knit on public transit. I knit all the time, but that gave me an opportunity to introduce the concept of knitting as resistance. And I really want to expand upon that concept some more. This may end up being a two-part video. We will see. First of all, in any authoritarian regime, arts and crafts, people expressing their own creativity, that is always going to be an act of resistance. But specifically here, I want to talk about a piece. Y'all have no idea how excited I am to have an excuse to talk about this. It's from 2012. It was presented at the Textile Society of America's annual symposium. It's entitled Knitting as Dissent, Female Resistance in America Since the Revolutionary War. It's by Tova Hermanson from the Costume Society of America. If you're watching this on YouTube, I will link to the PDF in the video description so you can go read the whole thing for yourself. Now, before I start, knitting is not an exclusively woman-owned, female-only craft and skill. Knitting is done by men all over the world and has been for a really long time, including knitters today. There have been a number of prominent knitwear designers who are men, women, non-binary folks. Whatever your gender is, knitting should be accessible to you. It's just that this piece focuses specifically on women throughout American history and their role in using knitting as dissent, knitting as resistance. We would be remiss, though, in excluding the reality that knitting has been presented as a feminine pursuit and as less than because of it for centuries. It's been relegated as a form of women's work. And that was part of my critique of Hank and SciShow's video about knitting and physics, is this knitting was inconsequential until academia got a hold of it. The way that women's skilled labor contributions are so often invisible or devalued. But I think there's going to be an interesting twist here as I get into this piece, because it's precisely because women and what we do have historically flown under the radar, been viewed as not worthy of much focus and attention, that knitting has worked so well in resistance movements when it is done by women. So I'm going to read to you from this speech. It'll probably be a two-part video because I have more thoughts at the end. The sun is also setting earlier and earlier, so I'm going to turn on my light in here. Okay, way better. I can see what I'm doing now. Primarily a feminine duty or pastime with granny connotations, knitting actually has a deliciously rich history of political subversion, and it's surfacing again in the new millennium with young generations. Historically, knitting has been an occupation of necessity, work, not leisure, with the dual purpose of clothing one's family and possibly training for future employment or extra income. These skills of discipline and obedience were instrumental in America's war for independence. I don't know if I will have time to get into it here, but it's not just America's war for independence, it's also the Civil War, it's also World War I and World War II, although knitting was also used as propaganda by the US government and by the British government. Anyway, the piece goes on to say, in post-industrial 20th century America, knitting's popularity and necessity has waxed and waned, and the reasons women pick up needles have morphed, but political and social dissent remain a repeating, not to mention overlooked, motivation. It has been speculated that knitting has always been women's work because it was an activity compatible with breastfeeding and childcare, in that it could be interrupted and resumed quite easily. Also, it's very portable, right? Girls learned to spin and knit at very young ages and then did so continuously to keep up with the time and labor-consuming demand of clothing for their families. These skills were put to the test for the years leading up to the Revolutionary War. Spinning, sewing, and knitting circles existed primarily as social work gatherings in America during the early colonial period, until Britain imposed increasingly heavy taxes on her her colonies, which culminated with the Stamp Act of 1765. To discuss the unconstitutionality of the Stamp Act and to prove that they could and would purchase no more British goods until it was repealed, women's spinning bees were restructured into spinning meetings. These were political demonstrations where women would come to spin, weave, and knit the most fiber goods to compensate for the boycotted material. Basically, spin-offs as a very public demonstration of like, look, we don't need these British goods. Our women here, they can make all that we need. These events were often hosted by local ministers, thus sacralizing daily work. Spinning and knitting demos became well-attended, festive spectator sports where men would come from the community to cheer on the women. In stark contrast to solitary domestic knitting, spinning parties like these could have as many as 90 participants. Those industrious women who could clothe themselves and their families in homespun and recycled garments from head to toe were deemed patriots, a term that in the colonial period was usually reserved for men. It's interesting to note that even though these women were called patriots, and even though patriotism was an important component, if not the impetus for these spinning gatherings, that a lot of documents at the time didn't refer to these women straight out as patriots in print. Only 4 of the 46 documented gatherings like this called the women daughters of liberty. They were usually described as daughters of industry, young women, the fair sex, or even noble-hearted nymphs. There would be similar puzzling reluctance of women to admit and embrace political implications in the knitters of the 1960s and 70s. It's interesting that women are doing something that's like so clearly, obviously political. In this case, a stand against the tyranny of the British government. And in the 1960s and 70s, there was quite a bit of knitting, both for environmental reasons, as a statement against the Vietnam War, for women's rights, for civil rights. And yet, for whatever reason, the political connection was either downplayed or not fully appreciated. In the years leading up to the revolution, during this boycott of British goods, colonial women became accustomed to clothing their families with not only homespun, but also hand-knit textiles. So it was really a short leap to providing their men uniforms and combat apparel when America finally went to war with England. Congress appointed a clothier general to assess and fulfill the Army's needs for clothing and blankets. The burden of fulfilling these supplies fell to townships, some of which published the names and tallies of knitters and their output to encourage healthy competition between women and between townships and to increase production. Knitting became very popular in colonial America. Martha Washington would make a show of knitting socks, knitting stockings when she was meeting with visitors in public. Right, we see that Eleanor Roosevelt did the same thing later on. In the lowest moments of America's war for independence, with especially unfortunate soldiers reportedly going naked, some industrious women would round up blankets, yarn, and worn-out clothing that they would patch and darn, or they would unravel and knit into new stockings, shirts, breeches, and blankets. They would often personally transport these upcycled textiles to the front themselves in order to distribute them. That's because women were better able to slip past the British. Again, remember, women and our contributions not gaining the notice of men was used to the advantage of Americans during the Revolution, but also further along in history as well. Knitting is so cozy and unthreatening that its very execution has been used to cover up subversive deeds. Though history books rarely include the stories of female characters like Old Mom Ranker, who would transport enemy information she overheard in her family's tavern to General George Washington. Y'all, she would write little notes about what the redcoats were saying, fold it up and stuff it into the middle of her balls of yarn, and then she would just travel with her knitting. Again, women fly under the radar. Knitting seen as, just some little women's work over there. Definitely not something political, definitely not something that spies would be doing, or like women who are knitting, they definitely wouldn't be spies, they wouldn't be part of the revolution. Now, obviously, knitting and darning were only a small part of the contribution that women gave to the Revolutionary War effort. Women were visible, even central to the revolution and to the patriot effort to transform political culture, crucial if the Americans were to sustain the claim that they were doing more than refusing to pay their fair share of taxes. Americans claimed both implicitly and explicitly that they were creating a new kind of politics, a democracy in which the people acted as constituent power, in which every adult citizen had an obligation to play an intelligent and thoughtful role in shaping the nation's destiny. The success of America's boycott of British textiles and goods was dependent upon women's endorsement and active contributions. No small feat, as it significantly increased women's workload. Okay, come back for part 2.